We like to believe that the villain lives outside of us, in the forest, in the castle, in the dark figure that threatens the hero's journey. Fairy tales seem to confirm this illusion. They give evil a face, a name, a body we can point to and say, "That is not me." But psychologically, this is where the story truly begins. Carl Jung called this rejected inner territory the shadow. It is not simply what is immoral or cruel. It is everything we were not allowed to become. Every impulse that did not fit the image required for love, belonging, or survival. The shadow forms quietly, early, and efficiently, and fairy tales, like dreams, dramatize this inner split with unsettling precision. The villain is rarely random. He is exaggerated, distorted, and often strangely fascinating. Why? Because he carries psychic material the conscious personality cannot tolerate. Rage that felt dangerous, desire that felt forbidden, ambition that threatened attachment. The villain becomes the container for these disowned forces, allowing the ego to remain good, innocent, and socially acceptable. This is why villains feel disproportionate, why they are cruel without apology, why they act on impulses the hero suppresses. They live without the internal brakes we develop to be loved. And this freedom, however terrifying, is also what makes them compelling. The psyche recognizes something familiar there, even if it refuses to name it. Jung warned that the more virtuous and one-sided the conscious attitude becomes, the darker and more autonomous the shadow grows. Fairy tales reflect this law. The purer the hero, the more monstrous the antagonist. The split must be maintained for the story to function, just as it is maintained within the psyche, but the cost of avoiding the shadow is high. What is not lived consciously is lived unconsciously. What is denied does not disappear, it acts from below. The villain we refuse to recognize internally often appears externally, projected onto others, fate, or imagined enemies. This is why fairy tales are populated with witches, traitors, and deceivers. They mirror a psychological truth. When the shadow is not faced, it returns disguised as threat. Marie-Louise von France emphasized that fairy tales show psychic processes in their purest form. The villain, in this sense, is not an error in the story. He is a necessity. He represents the unlived life of the hero, the emotional truth that could not yet be integrated. To fear the villain is natural, but to refuse him entirely is to refuse a part of the soul's energy. The shadow is dangerous, yes, but it is also vital. Within it lies assertiveness, instinct, and the raw force of life itself. The task is not to destroy the villain, but to understand why he had to appear. Because what we avoid within ourselves never stays silent for long. Betrayal in fairy tales is rarely just a plot device. It is not there merely to shock the listener or accelerate the story. Psychologically, betrayal appears at the precise moment when the psyche can no longer sustain its inner division. It is the archetypal image of a split that has gone too far. The traitor is almost never a stranger. He is a brother, a sister, a trusted companion, a familiar figure from within the hero's circle. This detail matters. Betrayal does not come from the outside world. It emerges from what was once close, relied upon, and emotionally invested in. In symbolic terms, the betrayer represents a psychic function that once served the ego but now turns against it. Jung understood the psyche as a dynamic system seeking balance. When certain instincts, emotions, or ambitions are systematically repressed, they do not simply remain passive. They reorganize. They form autonomous complexes. Betrayal is the moment when one of these disowned parts revolts. It no longer cooperates with the conscious personality's narrative of goodness, patience, or moral superiority. Fairy tales often show the hero betrayed at the threshold of transformation, just before the treasure is found, just before the marriage, the crown, or the return home. Psychologically, this reflects a critical inner truth. The ego cannot carry its old self-image into a new stage of development. Something must break. The loyal inner structure that upheld the previous identity becomes an obstacle, The traitor embodies this tension. He acts out what the hero cannot admit: resentment, envy, the wish to take rather than serve, the desire to abandon the moral contract that has become suffocating. Betrayal is not merely malice. It is the eruption of psychic imbalance. Marie-Louise von France noted that in fairy tales, evil often arises when something essential has been excluded from consciousness. The betrayer exposes this exclusion. His act is destructive, but it is also revelatory. It forces the ego to confront its own inner contradiction. The hero is betrayed because he has betrayed himself first, by denying parts of his nature that demanded recognition. This is why betrayal wounds so deeply. It touches an unconscious truth. The pain is not only about loss of trust in the other, but about the collapse of a false inner harmony. The psyche realizes that the unity it believed in was incomplete, maintained by suppression rather than integration. In psychological terms, betrayal shatters identification. It dismantles the image of who we thought we were: the good son, the loyal one, the selfless helper. The traitor forces a reckoning. He reveals that psychic loyalty without wholeness cannot endure. Fairy tales do not resolve betrayal quickly. The hero often falls into darkness, exile, or apparent death afterward. This pause is essential. It mirrors the inner descent required after the psyche's split is exposed. Only through this symbolic death can a more inclusive identity emerge. Betrayal, then, is not simply the enemy of the soul. It is a brutal messenger. It announces that the psyche demands reintegration, that the divided self can no longer survive intact, and that wholeness, though painful, has become unavoidable. The psyche does not speak in abstractions, it speaks in images. This is why fairy tales do not describe the shadow as a concept, a theory, or a moral flaw. They give it a body, a face, a presence that can be feared, recognized, and remembered. Carl Jung observed that what remains unconscious cannot be approached directly. The ego resists it. It explains it away, judges it, or denies it altogether. Fairy tales bypass this resistance by personifying the shadow. They turn inner conflicts into visible figures, allowing the psyche to encounter what it could not tolerate as an idea. The shadow appears as the witch, the wolf, the traitor, the jealous sibling, the false friend. These figures are rarely subtle. They are exaggerated, even grotesque. Psychologically, exaggeration serves a purpose. It forces attention. The shadow must be seen clearly before it can be related to consciously. A faint outline would not suffice. The image must disturb. Marie-Louise von France emphasized that fairy tales portray psychic structures in their simplest and most extreme forms. The shadow is therefore not nuanced or morally ambiguous. It is stark, relentless, one-sided. This does not mean it is unrealistic. It means it is accurate at a symbolic level. What has been repressed appears in distorted form. The ego prefers complexity because complexity allows avoidance. A clearly defined villain does not. When the shadow has a face, the psyche cannot pretend it does not exist. It stands there, blocking the path, demanding a response. This confrontation is not intellectual, it is emotional and instinctive. There is another reason fairy tales give the shadow a face: projection. The psyche initially meets its darkness outside itself. This is not a failure. It is a necessary first step. To see the shadow internally too early would overwhelm the ego. By placing it in the external world, the tale allows the listener to engage safely at a symbolic distance. The villain carries emotions the conscious personality refuses to claim: hatred, greed, sexual desire, the will to dominate, the wish to destroy what threatens one's identity. When these impulses are embodied in a character, they can be watched, feared, and slowly recognized without immediate self-condemnation. Fairy tales also show that the shadow is not merely destructive. The villain often guards the treasure, the transformation, or the threshold. This is not accidental. Psychologically, what blocks the way also protects it. The shadow stands at the border between the known self and the larger psyche. Jung noted that individuation does not occur by eliminating the shadow, but by withdrawing projections and integrating its energy. Fairy tales hint at this truth without stating it. They allow the image to work on the listener unconsciously, preparing the psyche for a future encounter with its own darkness. The face of the shadow is therefore not an enemy invented by the story. It is a mirror crafted by the psyche itself, a necessary image that makes the invisible visible. Because only what can be seen can eventually be related to, and only what is related to can become human. Envy in fairy tales is rarely loud. It does not announce itself openly. It works quietly, patiently, behind familiar faces, and this is precisely why the traitor so often embodies it. Psychologically, envy is one of the most repressed expressions of the will to power. It is not simply wanting what the other has. It is the unbearable experience of witnessing another live a destiny the psyche secretly desired for itself. The traitor envies because he feels overlooked by life. He stands close to the hero, sometimes assisting, sometimes following, yet never fully chosen. This proximity is crucial. Envy does not arise between strangers. It arises where comparison is unavoidable, where the psyche measures itself against an image of what it could have been. Jung understood the will to power not only as domination, but as the drive toward realization. When this drive is blocked, denied, or moralized away, it does not disappear. It turns sour. It becomes resentment, envy, passive aggression. The traitor carries this poisoned energy. He wants what the hero represents, but cannot consciously admit this longing. Fairy tales often show the traitor acting at the moment of success, when the hero is closest to recognition, love, or wholeness. Psychologically, this reflects a deep truth. The repressed will to power attacks precisely when it feels most humiliated. The ego's achievement exposes the shadow's deprivation. Marie-Louise von Franz noted that envy in fairy tales often stems from an unconscious inferiority complex. The traitor does not feel small consciously. He feels justified, entitled, wronged. His betrayal is experienced internally as compensation, a way to restore balance by taking what was unfairly given to another. This is why traitors rarely see themselves as evil. They believe they are correcting an injustice. The psyche does this to protect itself from guilt. The shadow reframes envy as righteousness, power as necessity, destruction as survival. The tragedy is that the traitor acts out a truth the ego refused to face. Somewhere within, the hero also carries ambition, hunger, and the desire to surpass limits. But these forces were split off in favor of a morally acceptable identity. The traitor lives what the hero disowned. Fairy tales warn that when the will to power is denied expression, it does not become spiritual. It becomes destructive. The psyche demands movement, growth, assertion. Without conscious channels, these energies turn against the personality from within. The traitor's fall is often swift and severe, but the psychological lesson is not punishment. It is exposure. The story reveals what happens when power is sought unconsciously through sabotage rather than integration. To recognize the traitor archetype within is to ask an uncomfortable question. Where has my own ambition been silenced? Where has envy replaced honest desire? The fairy tale does not answer this for us. It simply places the figure before our eyes and waits. Because the repressed will to power will always find a way to speak. The only question is whether it will do so as creative force or as betrayal. The shadow does not emerge to destroy the soul. It emerges to correct it. This is one of the most difficult truths in Jungian psychology, and one of the most misunderstood. We prefer to see the shadow as a moral failure, a flaw to be eliminated. Fairy tales tell a different story. They reveal the shadow as a compensatory force, arising precisely where consciousness has become too narrow, too rigid, or too idealized. Jung described the psyche as a self-regulating system. When the conscious attitude becomes one-sided, The unconscious responds with equal and opposite intensity. The shadow is that response. It carries what consciousness has excluded in the name of goodness, adaptation, or identity. Its appearance signals imbalance, not corruption. In fairy tales, the shadow often enters the story after the hero has defined himself too cleanly, too obedient, too virtuous, too aligned with expectations. Psychologically, this reflects an ego that has sacrificed vitality for approval. The soul compensates by producing figures who live what the ego cannot. The villain's cruelty compensates for denied aggression. The traitor's ambition compensates for suppressed desire. The witch's autonomy compensates for infantilized innocence. These figures shock the moral sense of the ego, but they restore psychic balance by reintroducing lost energies into the system. Marie-Louise von Franz emphasized that the unconscious always aims at wholeness, not comfort. The shadow's task is not to protect the ego's self-image, but to restore the totality of the personality. When instinct, power, sexuality, or anger are split off, the soul becomes fragmented. The shadow emerges to heal that fragmentation, even if its methods appear hostile. This is why encounters with the shadow feel disruptive. They destabilize certainty, they threaten identity, but they also bring relief, a strange sense of truth. The psyche recognizes itself again, even in darkness. Fairy tales show that when the shadow is ignored, it grows stronger and more destructive. When it is acknowledged, it transforms. The same force that terrorized becomes a source of strength, clarity, and grounding. The energy does not disappear. It changes its role. The compensatory function of the shadow can be seen in the way villains often provoke growth. They force the hero into action, into differentiation, into confrontation with inner limits. Without them, the story would stagnate. Psychologically, without the shadow, the ego remains naive, inflated, or falsely virtuous. Jung warned that spiritual ideals are especially prone to shadow formation. The higher the conscious aspiration, the darker the unconscious compensation. Fairy tales capture this danger symbolically, showing how exaggerated goodness invites equally exaggerated evil. The task of individuation is not to side with the shadow, nor to suppress it, but to relate to it, to listen to what it compensates for, to ask what has been excluded in the pursuit of being acceptable, lovable, or enlightened. The shadow appears because the soul refuses to remain incomplete. Its message is uncompromising but honest. Wholeness cannot be achieved by light alone. When the villain is not integrated, the story does not truly end. It repeats, it mutates, it returns in different forms, wearing new masks. Fairy tales understand this psychological law with unsettling clarity. Evil that is merely defeated, banished, or killed without being consciously related to never disappears from the soul. It waits. Jung warned that what we do not make conscious becomes fate. When the shadow is not integrated, it is not experienced as part of oneself, but as an external force that seems to act independently. The individual feels persecuted by circumstances, betrayed by others, blocked by life itself. In truth, the unintegrated villain has simply moved from the inner world to the outer stage. Fairy tales often show this indirectly. The hero slays the monster, yet the kingdom remains barren, or peace is restored, but only temporarily. Psychologically, this reflects an ego victory without psychic transformation. The energy carried by the villain has been suppressed, not transformed. The imbalance remains. An unintegrated shadow tends to express itself through projection. The individual becomes increasingly certain about who is evil, ignorant, dangerous, or corrupt, always outside. Moral rigidity replaces reflection. The psyche protects itself from inner conflict by locating all darkness in the other. This produces a fragile sense of righteousness and a growing intolerance toward ambiguity. Marie-Louise von Franz noted that when shadow integration fails, the psyche compensates by intensifying unconscious behavior. This can appear as compulsions, sudden emotional outbursts, depression, or a chronic sense of meaninglessness. The soul is signaling that something essential has been excluded from conscious life. In fairy tales, the villain who is not integrated often returns as a more destructive force. The witch comes back more powerful. the traitor reappears in another form. Symbolically, this shows that the psyche escalates when its message is ignored. What was first a warning becomes a crisis. There is also a subtler consequence. Without shadow integration, the ego remains infantilized. It continues to see itself as purely good, well-intentioned, and victimized. Responsibility is avoided. Inner authority never develops. The individual remains dependent on external validation and moral certainty. Jung emphasized that integration does not mean indulging the shadow. It means recognizing it as part of the total personality. Aggression becomes assertiveness, desire becomes direction, power becomes responsibility. When this does not occur, the shadow seeks expression in distorted ways. Fairy tales show that true resolution occurs only when the hero undergoes inner change. When humility replaces innocence, when awareness replaces naivety, the villain's defeat then corresponds to an inner shift, not merely an external victory. To leave the villain unintegrated is to live in perpetual conflict with one's own depths. Life becomes a battleground rather than a dialogue. The soul remains divided. The fairy tale warns us quietly but firmly. What you refuse to recognize within will always return from without. Not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a truth demanding to be lived. Meeting the shadow is not the same as surrendering to it. This distinction is essential, and fairy tales are careful to preserve it. They do not invite the hero to become the villain, nor do they suggest that darkness should rule the soul. Instead, they depict a far more delicate psychological task: conscious encounter without identification. Jung emphasized that the danger of shadow work lies not only in repression, but also in inflation. When the ego discovers the shadow, it may become fascinated by it. Power, instinct, rage, and freedom feel intoxicating after long suppression. The risk is that the ego, having lived too long in moral rigidity, swings to the opposite extreme and identifies with what it has just discovered. Fairy tales symbolically warn against this through figures who become monstrous when they over-identify with dark forces. The witch who devours children, the king who becomes a tyrant, the helper who turns into a usurper. These images show what happens when shadow energy is unleashed without consciousness or ethical containment. Meeting the shadow requires holding tension. The ego must be strong enough to acknowledge aggression without acting it out blindly, to recognize desire without allowing it to dominate, to admit envy without justifying betrayal. This psychological position is uncomfortable. It offers no immediate relief, but it is the birthplace of maturity. Marie-Louise von Franz noted that fairy tales often delay resolution after the shadow appears. The hero wanders, waits, or suffers disorientation. This symbolic pause reflects the inner work required to digest shadow material. Quick action would mean acting it out. Stillness allows reflection. The hero who survives the encounter with the shadow does not emerge purer. He emerges more human, less certain, more grounded. Innocence is replaced by awareness. Moral perfection gives way to responsibility. This is the difference between repression and integration. Integration means that the ego remains the center of consciousness, but it is no longer alone. It is informed by instinct, tempered by humility, and protected from naivete. Aggression becomes boundary. Power becomes agency. Darkness becomes depth. Fairy tales show that the shadow often withdraws or transforms once it is consciously met. The monster may shrink. The villain may lose power. The threat no longer dominates the psyche because its energy has been reclaimed. What terrified no longer needs to terrorize. Jung insisted that individuation requires ethical consciousness. Without it, shadow work becomes dangerous. The task is not to justify cruelty, selfishness, or domination, but to understand their psychological roots and redirect their energy toward life. To meet the shadow without becoming it is to accept inner conflict as permanent. Wholeness is not harmony. It is dialogue. The light does not erase the dark, and the dark does not replace the light. They inform each other. Fairy tales leave us with this quiet wisdom. You do not overcome the shadow by defeating it, nor by obeying it. You overcome it by recognizing it as part of yourself and choosing again and again to act consciously in its presence. Before I leave you, I want to turn the mirror gently in your direction. As you listen to these villains, traitors, and shadow figures, which one unsettled you the most? Was it the cruelty, the envy, the hunger for power, or the uncomfortable sense of recognition beneath it? I ask myself this every time I return to these stories. Where have I projected my own darkness instead of meeting it within? Where have I blamed fate, others, or circumstance for something that was asking to be acknowledged in my own soul? Perhaps the question is not whether we have a shadow, but whether we are willing to listen to what it compensates for in our lives right now. If this reflection resonated with you, I invite you to stay with the journey. Subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share your thoughts in the comments. Not as confessions, but as symbols, questions, and insights. Your engagement helps this space grow into a living dialogue of depth and meaning. Thank you for walking with me into the darker regions of the fairy tale and the psyche. In the next videos, we will continue exploring how these ancient stories quietly guide the soul toward wholeness. Until then, stay attentive to the images that disturb you. They often know the way forward.